The night of May 13th, 1822, the town of St. Roch lay under a choking fog, the kind that seemed to seep into bones rather than just eyes. Locals whispered that the mist wasn't natural, that it carried with it a darkness older than the cypress trees that loomed like sentinels over the bayou. That night, a woman known as the White Widow vanished from her plantation home. No struggle, no scream, only a door ajar, swinging like a pendulum in the still air. Few remembered her face clearly. Her widow's veil had shrouded her features for months. What people remembered was her presence, sharp as the crack of a whip, yet chillingly silent, as though she carried with her a shadow that consumed sound. The servants said they saw her walking into the fog, but none dared follow. Some claimed they heard faint laughter in the distance, high-pitched and hollow, echoing off the swamp. The disappearance wasn't just local gossip. By sunrise, authorities found the plantation eerily intact, yet every mirror in the main house was shattered, shards littering the floor like spilled teeth. In the village church, a single candle burned in the widow's pew, though no one had seen her there for years. As years would pass, St. Roch would hold its secrets in a silence so dense it could choke a man. Generations of children whispered of the White Widow, a figure who visited the dreams of the guilty and the frightened alike. Scholars, historians, and ghost hunters alike have tried to trace her life, her lineage, and her sudden disappearance, but the records stop abruptly at May 13th. Something about her defied documentation, as though the universe itself erased her from official memory. And yet, the shadows remembered. A diary surfaced decades later, hidden in the floorboards of a nearby seminary, containing entries so unnerving that the ink itself seemed to smear as the reader's eyes moved across it. The words spoke of black rituals hidden beneath the veneer of piety, of children sent to orphanages who never returned, and of a power that the widow claimed was older than God and deadlier than men. St. Roch still stands, cloaked in moss and legend. And in the fog, if one listens carefully, a whisper of white can be heard sliding over the waters, an invitation, a warning, or perhaps a memory that refuses to die. Genealogists and archivists attempting to trace the White Widow's bloodline encountered records that seemed deliberately corrupted. Birth certificates, marriage records, even tax documents were either missing or suspiciously altered. Scholars hypothesized that she had knowledge of something forbidden, something tied to the earliest days of Louisiana's settlements, a power that predated the state itself. The widow's home, a sprawling Creole mansion now rotting under vines and time, held hints of her life. Cupboards with locks rusted shut, yet shelves empty, as if the contents had evaporated. Behind the walls, strange symbols were found etched in the plaster, spirals and crosses that didn't match any Christian or native designs, their meaning lost to centuries of silence. Those who dared enter reported strange phenomena. Clocks stopped at 3:13 a.m. Mirrors reflected shadows that weren't present. Even the dogs of St. Roch refused to cross the threshold of her estate. Many theorized the widow had discovered a method to manipulate fear itself, a control so profound it left its mark not on the living, but on reality itself. Stories of the orphanages she patronized added another layer to the terror. Children were sent away from families, purportedly for education or refuge, but they rarely returned. Some survivors, decades later, recounted nights filled with chanting, masked figures, and a figure in white overseeing proceedings. The town dismissed them as hysteria, but the consistency of these accounts cannot be ignored. As the fog rolls over St. Roch today, locals tell of glimpses of white through the trees, a fleeting figure, motionless yet observing, leaving a chill that sinks into bones. The White Widow's legacy was not death alone, but an inheritance of fear, a record of human frailty manipulated by an intelligence both patient and malevolent. In the years following the widow's disappearance, St. Roch became a hub for whispers about a hidden orphanage, financed and overseen by the White Widow herself. No record marked its location on any map. Children sent there vanished without a trace, and the few who returned were changed, silent, withdrawn, and haunted by eyes that seemed to see into nothingness. The orphanage was said to sit beyond the bayou, reachable only by paths that the living could rarely follow. Travelers spoke of waters that reflected not the sky but an endless darkness, and trees that bent unnaturally, guiding, or trapping any who dared approach. The building itself was described as enormous yet impossible to comprehend. Corridors that twisted like serpents, staircases that led nowhere, and doors that opened into rooms frozen in time. Survivors, decades later, described nightly rituals conducted under the guise of education. Candles burned in geometric patterns across the floor. Figures cloaked in white, sometimes more than one, watched silently. The children were made to chant, to recite names they had never learned, and to kneel before symbols etched deep into the wooden floors. When pressed for details, the survivors' accounts would falter, their voices lowering, as though the memory itself was dangerous to speak aloud. Rumors spread that the orphanage was not merely a home, but a laboratory of the mind, a place where fear and obedience were cultivated as tools. Some historians now suspect the White Widow had discovered methods of psychological domination far ahead of her time, blending superstition, suggestion, and subtle cruelty into a system that left invisible scars across generations. St. Roch's town council, largely complicit or terrified, claimed ignorance. But old letters reveal subtle bribery, anonymous threats, and disappearances of those who pressed too hard. The orphanage, like the widow herself, seemed untouchable, a manifestation of power operating above law, morality, and human understanding. The local church, built in 1798, stood as a pillar of morality for St. Roch, yet it too bore the widow's fingerprints. The White Widow was known to attend services, her presence commanding attention while radiating an unspoken menace. Parishioners claimed she often lingered after Mass, murmuring to the priest in hushed tones that left him pale and shaken. Church records from the period show unexplained anomalies, donations far exceeding the widow's documented wealth, baptism entries that vanish mid-page, and confessions that were marked with symbols instead of names. Scholars argue that the widow had infiltrated the very heart of spiritual authority, corrupting it subtly, leaving a trail that would confuse historians for centuries. Some accounts describe a hidden chamber beneath the church, discovered only during renovations in the late 1800s. Inside, walls were covered with paintings of children with hollow eyes, faceless clergy, and a figure in white holding a blackened mirror. Candles were burned down to stubs, and a faint smell of rot lingered despite decades of air exposure. The chamber was quickly sealed again, for the safety of the town, as one overseer noted. The White Widow's power was not only physical or social, it was metaphysical, psychological. She manipulated the perception of reality, leaving those who opposed her unsure of what was true. The town of St. Roch became a stage for her experiments, the church an unwitting accomplice. Decades after the disappearance, a journal surfaced in a forgotten seminary, its pages brittle and ink smeared with age. The diary, believed to belong to the White Widow, documented practices so disturbing that clergy refused to speak of them. Among the entries were names, hundreds of them, each crossed out with a jagged black line. The diary described rituals conducted at precise hours, at locations where earth and water converged, and often with children as witnesses. One passage suggested that the widow believed fear itself was a vessel. It must be nurtured, whispered to, made to grow in the marrow, for only then will the world bend to the will of the unseen. Historians examining the text note the mixture of European mysticism, local folklore, and personal obsession. Symbols recur: a white veil, a black mirror, spirals that spiral back into themselves, a language of power meant to be unbroken, unchallenged, and untraceable. The diary ends abruptly on May 13, 1822, the very night she vanished. Yet marginal notes hint that she had prepared a successor, a secret network embedded in families, orphanages, and clergy alike. This suggests that the White Widow's influence did not die with her disappearance. It mutated, leaving St. Roch forever haunted by what had been left behind. By the mid-1830s, St. Roch had grown into a town that seemed ordinary at first glance. Yet beneath its cobblestone streets and shuttered windows, an unsettling conformity persisted. Families whispered when children asked questions they shouldn't. Elders stared at strangers as though memories of the past could physically burn them. The White Widow had vanished, but the town had not forgotten her. It had learned to obey her absence. Every unexplained disappearance, Every child who returned changed. Every priest who aged before his time was a reminder that some forces in St. Roch were beyond human law. Travelers described an oppressive atmosphere. Visitors felt watched, even when alone. Windows reflected shadows not present, and the local tavern's clock often stopped at the same hour, 3:13 a.m. Patrons spoke of fleeting glimpses of a white figure moving through the fog, and animals howled without reason. Historians studying census records found anomalies. Entire families erased, others suddenly listed with children who never existed. Some argue this wasn't clerical error but a deliberate erasure, an attempt to hide the network of fear the White Widow had created. St. Roch's silence was deafening. Ordinary townsfolk, priests, and teachers alike lived under the weight of unspoken knowledge. They had become silent witnesses, collaborators, or victims of a system that no longer needed the widow to assert itself. Power in St. Roch was subtle yet absolute. The mayor, the church, and the plantation owners all played roles in sustaining the illusion of normality. Documents show payments to unknown entities, letters warning families to remain silent, and the mysterious disappearance of a councilman who tried to investigate. The White Widow's influence was never direct. It was insidious, like ink spreading through water. Fear itself became law. Clergy whispered prayers with double meanings, teachers instructed children in obedience disguised as education, and neighbors observed each other with careful calculation. Even law enforcement seemed strangely compliant. Arrests were rare, and when made, the accused often recanted stories of terror they had barely spoken aloud. Scholars suggest that the widow had weaponized psychological control, creating an invisible hierarchy where resistance was punished not with violence, but with dread so total it broke the will without leaving marks. Accounts of those who claimed to see the White Widow after her disappearance are chilling. One man, a young sailor returning to St. Roch in 1835, swore he saw her standing atop the Bayou levee at dawn, her veil glowing in the mist. She spoke no words, yet he felt his thoughts unravel, memories of wrongdoings surfacing unbidden. Children often reported seeing her in dreams before waking to find bruises or scratches on their arms. Never enough to explain, but enough to confirm that the unseen force was real. Researchers studying these patterns describe the phenomenon as a form of psychological haunting, but locals insist it is something older, something alive. It was during this period that whispers of the Black Mirror began circulating, a rumored artifact the widow possessed, said to reveal not one's reflection, but the sins, fears, and secrets hidden deep within the soul. The Black Mirror became the subject of legend almost immediately. According to survivors and local lore, it was small, dark, and impossibly smooth. Those who gazed into it claimed to see their worst fears enacted, their sins magnified, and sometimes glimpses of events yet to come. One account describes a servant girl who looked into the mirror and fainted for 3 days. When she awoke, she spoke only in riddles and gestures, referring constantly to the widow's return. Townsfolk who dismissed the stories soon experienced accidents, illnesses, and misfortune, subtle, yet devastating. The mirror's origin was unknown. Some said it had been forged in Europe and smuggled to Louisiana. Others claimed the widow had created it herself, using forbidden knowledge drawn from texts that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The presence of the Black Mirror confirmed what the townspeople had long feared. The White Widow's power had transcended the human plane, leaving behind a relic capable of bending perception, memory, and reality itself. The orphaned children were the most reliable witnesses. Now adults, their testimonies were fragmented but consistent. They spoke of waking in the dead of night to find themselves in unfamiliar rooms, surrounded by figures in white. They remembered chanting, mirrors, and whispers that promised both knowledge and terror. Psychologists studying the survivors noted patterns of dissociation, hypervigilance, and what modern science might call trauma-induced hallucinations. But the consistency of their accounts suggested a reality beyond imagination. Every detail, every chant, every symbol, every fleeting shadow pointed back to a mind that had learned to manipulate fear itself. The White Widow's legacy, they agreed, was not simply that of a missing woman but a blueprint of control, a carefully orchestrated haunting that had seeped into the marrow of an entire town. Her name was whispered, her influence unseen, yet omnipresent, a reminder that some histories are buried not because they are forgotten, but because they are too dangerous to remember. Even decades after the White Widow vanished, the fog returned with uncanny precision. Locals claimed it came at the same hour each year, 3:13 a.m., rolling across the bayou and swallowing the town. Some said it was no natural mist, but a lingering presence, the widow's shadow manifesting as air. Those who ventured out found themselves lost, wandering in circles, hearing whispers in languages unknown, their own memories becoming unreliable. Scholars of folklore note that St. Roch's fog is unlike any other, dense yet shifting, chilling yet imperceptible, as if the very atmosphere conspired to remind the living of what they could not see, that some powers leave no body, yet inhabit the world nonetheless. Renovations of old homes in St. Roch occasionally revealed hidden chambers, bricked up and covered with layers of plaster. Inside, one could find fragments of the widow's rituals, burned candles, strange sigils, and small mirrors blackened with age. Archaeologists studying these chambers observed patterns suggesting the widow had created a map, a network of secret spaces throughout the town. These rooms were not merely physical hiding places. They were nodes of control, places where the veil between fear and reality was thinnest. The network suggested meticulous planning, a city within a city, and a mind that had anticipated disappearance. Each chamber reflected the same design principles: disorientation, psychological tension, and reinforcement of authority through fear. Survivors spoke of a choir of silence, a group of children hidden in orphanages, trained to follow instructions without question. They were made to observe the world but never intervene, their obedience cultivated through ritualized fear. The choir's influence persisted as they grew into adults. Many became figures of authority themselves, teachers, priests, and caretakers, unwittingly continuing the widow's work. Their silence was not mere compliance. It was an inherited discipline, a psychological imprint left by the widow herself. A cache of letters discovered in a plantation attic revealed a disturbing correspondence between the widow and clergy, detailing methods of surveillance and influence. These letters hinted at her broader plan, to create a town controlled not by law, but by pervasive, invisible terror. The language was meticulous, almost clinical. She described manipulation as art, the right hint of fear at the right moment, the strategic placement of objects, and the orchestration of absence. The letters suggested the widow had understood psychological principles far ahead of her time. Genealogical studies show entire family lines in St. Roch erased from records shortly after the widow's disappearance. Children sent to orphanages were never recorded as returning, and older relatives seemed to vanish without obituary or mention. Some theorized the widow had intentionally wiped certain family lines to consolidate her influence, leaving behind only those who could be controlled. St. Roch became a living experiment, a microcosm of fear and obedience, stretching across decades. The Black Mirror was never found again, yet its legacy remained. Those who claimed to see it or its reflection described psychological unraveling. Faces morphing into unknown entities, voices calling secrets from the past, and a compulsion to act in ways they could not explain. Psychologists reviewing the accounts described this as trauma-induced hallucination, yet the consistency across decades and families suggested something beyond human psychology. The mirror, real or symbolic, represented the widow's enduring power to bend perception, memory, and morality itself. Local folklore describes the fog children, ghostly figures seen walking through the bayou fog. Witnesses claim these are the lost orphans, now spirits manipulated by the widow's lingering presence. They are not threatening in a physical sense, yet their appearance causes intense psychological unease. The children serve as a living reminder of the widow's reach. Even in death, her influence persists, an echo of fear across generations. Decades later, scholars discovered that seminaries in Louisiana held hidden texts, allegedly authored by the widow or inspired by her teachings. These texts combined European mysticism with local folklore, emphasizing subtle psychological manipulation and the use of fear as a tool. The existence of these texts confirmed suspicions that the widow's influence extended beyond St. Roch. infiltrating institutions meant to guide morality. Her shadow, it seemed, stretched across the state, touching minds without ever being seen. The final pages of the widow's diary, long thought missing, were discovered in a priest's private collection. The entries were fragmented but chilling. She spoke of a final veil and a network of silent witnesses prepared to enforce her legacy. The diary hinted at a plan that extended centuries, a way to survive disappearance and death by embedding fear and control in the very structures of society. It was a blueprint for psychological dominion, a map of unseen power, and a warning that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. St. Roch today is a quiet town, draped in moss and fog. Outsiders sense little of the horrors hidden beneath its serene surface. Yet the White Widow's legacy endures. In the orphans grown into authority, in hidden chambers, in folklore, and in the psychological imprint on generations. The fog returns. Shadows linger. Mirrors, blackened or absent, still haunt those who dare to remember. St. Roch is a monument to what remains when power is wielded not by violence, but by subtle manipulation, fear, and silence. The White Widow vanished, yet she remains. In the mist, in the whispers, in the echoes of children and adults alike, she waits, not for revenge, but for remembrance. And in remembering, the living may glimpse the terrifying truth. Some secrets were never meant to be discovered, yet refuse to die.